Oversea Under Stone, Day 7, Part 2, Chapter 14. Barney blinked at the darkness. As his eyes grew accustomed to being out of the sunlight, vague objects took shape in the dark. He realized that the light from the entrance penetrated further inside than they had realized. As for the first few yards, at least, he could see the faint shine of the slimy green weed covering the walls and roof of the cave, and the glint of water lying along the bottom in a shallow, unmoving stream. He moved warily forward, one hand touching the roof and the other stretched out to one side. He could feel a slight, steady pull on the line round his waist from Simon holding it behind him. Very loud in the enclosed silence of the cave, he could hear the splash of their feet through the water and his brother breathing. Go carefully, Simon said behind him. He spoke softly, almost in a whisper, but the cave echoed his voice into a husking mutter that filled the space all around them. I am. You might bump your head. You might bump yours. Mind this bit here. It comes down lower. Put your hand up on the roof and you'll feel it. I can, Simon said fervently. His neck was bent uncomfortably downwards. Taller than Barney, he had to stoop slightly all the while to avoid hitting his head on the slimy rock above. Occasionally a large cold drop of water dripped down inside his shirt collar. Isn't it cold? Freezing. Barney's shorts were clinging clammily to the tops of his legs, and he felt the air chill through his shirt. He was finding it more and more difficult to make out any shapes around him, and soon he paused uneasily, feeling the darkness close in as if it were pressing on his eyes. Groping upwards, his fingers could no longer feel the roof. Ahead of him it rose out of reach, and he clutched at air. Wait a minute, Simon. His voice came eerily back at him from all sides. I think it gets higher here, but I can't see a thing now. You've got those matches? Simon felt his way along the line to where Barney stood. He touched his shoulder, and Barney felt more comforted at the contact than he would have even admitted even to himself. Don't move. I'm letting go of the line for a minute. Simon groped in his pocket for the matches and opened the box, feeling the edges carefully to make sure he had it in the right way up. The first two matches grated obstinately on the box as he tried to strike them, and nothing happened. The third flared up but broke as it did so, burning Simon's fingers, so he dropped it with an exclamation before they could blink away the dazzle of the sudden light. There was a small hiss as it dropped into the water around their feet. Buck up, said Barney. I'm going as fast as I can. Oh, that's it. The fourth match was dry and rasped into flame. Flickering, Simon cupped his hand to shelter it. Funny, there must be a draught in here. I can't feel one. The match can. That's good. It means there must be an opening somewhere at the other end, so it is the right cave after all. Simon's hand hid the dazzle of the little flame, and Barney peered hastily round the wavering light. Their shadows danced huge and grotesque on the wall. He looked up and took a few careful steps forward. Hold it up. Hey, come on. The roof does go up higher here. You'll be able to stand upright. Simon stepped cautiously towards him, bent over the match, and straightened his back with a gasp of relief. Then the match burned his fingers, and he dropped it. At once the darkness wrapped them like a blanket again. Hang on, I'll light another one. Well, wait a minute. We don't want to waste them. I could see a bit of the way ahead when it went out, so we can go that far before you light the next. Barney shut his eyes. Somehow, even though the cave was just as dark when his eyes were open, he found shutting them gave him a sense of being safer. Still touching the slippery wall with his fingertips, he moved 2 or 3 paces forward. Simon followed him with one hand on his shoulder, staring ahead in the darkness, but seeing as little as if a thick black curtain were hanging close before his face. They went on into the cave for what seemed a long time. Every few moments Simon struck a match, and they moved forward while the dim light lasted, and for the few remembered paces after it flickered out. Once they tried to light the candle stump, but it only sputtered obstinately, so Simon put it back in his pocket. The air was cold but fresh on their faces. Although there was a smell all around them of salt and seaweed as if they were under the sea, it was not difficult to breathe. The silence, like the darkness, seemed almost solid, broken by their own footsteps and an occasional echoing musical plop as water somewhere dripped from the roof of the cave. As Simon was standing still, fumbling with the matchbox again, Barney felt the line round his waist jerk tight and dig into him. Once, twice. There's 2 poles on the line. It must be Jane. 10 minutes. Gosh, I thought we'd been in here for hours. I'll signal back, Simon said. He struck a match and saw the line thin and taut in its light. Taking firm hold of it, he gave 2 slow, steady pulls on the direction from which they had come. Funny to think of Jane on the other end, Barney said. Wonder how much there is left. Gosh, do you think we shall run out? How much line was there? Quite a lot, said Simon, more optimistically than he felt. We've been going awfully slowly. Ow! The match burned down to his fingers, and he dropped it hastily. There was no hiss as it fell. As they moved on, groping, Simon suddenly realized that he had been listening for the noise. Stop a tick, Barney. He scuffed at the ground with one foot and peered down. The floor's not wet anymore. My shoes still squelch, Barney said. That's the water inside them, idiot, not outside. Simon's voice boomed hollowly round the cave, and he hastily dropped it to a whisper again, half afraid that the noise might bring the roof down on them. The sides aren't slimy here either, Barney said suddenly. It's dry rock. It has been for some time, actually, only I hadn't really taken any notice. Another match fizzed alight as Simon held it to the one dying in his fingers. He held the flame close to the wall. They saw bare gray granite, veined here and there with a white sparkling rock, and no seaweed. The ground, when Barney stooped to touch it, was covered with a kind of dusty sand. We must be going uphill. The sea can't ever have come in this far, but we heard it booming about from up the top this morning. Does that mean we've come past the opening of the chimney bit? Barney craned his neck back to look at the roof. I don't think so, Simon said uncertainly. The noise would carry a long way. Hey, look ahead, quick. This match is going out. Barney peered forward at the now familiar picture that he was never afterwards to forget. A narrow, shadow-swung walls, tunneling into the dark, holding them in a cramped, unfriendly grip. And in the second before the darkness came down on them again, he thought he saw the curtain of shadow at the end near it had been before. He moved hesitantly forward, and then some instinct told him to stop. He put out his hand in the silent darkness. It met solid rock a few inches from his face. Simon, it's a dead end. What? Incredulity and disappointment rose in Simon's voice. He struggled with the matches. He could feel the bottom of the box through them now, and realized that there could not be many left. In the flickering light, it was difficult to tell shadow from darkness, but they saw that the cave had not actually come to an end. Instead, it changed, just in front of them, to a far narrower passage, tall and thin, with a great boulder wedged between its sides, about 3 feet from the ground. Above their heads, out of the reach, the cleft was open to the roof, but there was no way of climbing up to it. The boulder blocked their path. We'll never get through that, Simon said in despair. There must have been a fall of rock since the Cornishmen went through. Barney looked down at the forbidding dark gap that remained at the bottom of the cleft, jagged and sinister through the dancing shadows, and swallowed. He was beginning to wish very much that they were back in the sunlight again. Then he thought of the Grail, and then of Mr. Hastings' face. I can get through underneath if I crawl. No, Simon said at once. It's dangerous. But we can't go back now, Barney said, gained confidence as he began to argue. We've got this far. We may just have a few feet away from it. I'll come out again if it's too narrow. Oh, come on, Simon, let me try. The match went out. We haven't got many left, Simon said out of the darkness. They'll run out soon. We've just got to make that candle light, or we shall be stuck in the dark. Where are you? Groping his way along the line towards Barney, he took his hand and put the matchbox into it. Then he felt in his own pocket for the stump of candle, rubbing its wick hopefully on his shirt to dry it. Now light one of the matches. There was a noise behind them in the darkness, like a stone falling, a grating, rattling noise, and then silence again. What was that? They listened nervously, but could hear only the sudden violent thumping of their own hearts. Barney struck a match, his hand shaking. The cave sprang into light again around them, with only the darkness pressing mockingly from the direction of the noise. It wasn't anything, Simon said at last, just a stone we must have brushed loose. Here. He held the candle stub to the flame. The match burned right down, but still the candle wick only sputtered as it had before. They tried again, holding the breath, and this time the wick caught and burned with a long, smoking yellow flame. Hold these, Barney said with determination. I'm going in there. He gave Simon back the last few loose matches and took the candle. Look, he said, shielding the smoking flame from the draught with his other hand. It's not so low, really. I can go on my hands and knees. Simon peered at the entrance unhappily. Well, good, for goodness sake, be careful, and pull at the line if you get stuck. I'll keep hold of it. Barney went down on his hands and knees and crawled into the dark opening beneath the wedged rock, holding the dangerously flickering candle in front of him. The draught seemed to be stronger now. The rock brushed his body on all sides so that he had to keep his head down and his elbows in, and for a moment he almost panicked with the sense of being shut in. But before the panic could take hold, the shadows looming around one point of candle changed their shape, and he raised his head without hitting the rock. He crawled a little farther, and the floor rough and gritty under his knees, and found not only that he could stand upright, but that the cave was much wider. The pool of light cast by his carefully guarded flame did not even show the walls on either side. Are you all right? Simon's anxious voice came muffled through the opening behind him. Barney bent down. It's okay. It widens out again here. That must be an entrance. I'm going on. He felt the wine at his waist tighten as Simon jerked an answer as he set off slowly across the cave. The darkness opened before him in the small light from his inch of candle, already burning down and dripping hot wax over his fingernails. When he glanced back over his shoulder, he could no longer see the entrance from which he had come. Hello, Barney said tentatively into the darkness. His voice whispered back at him in a sinister, eerie way, not booming and reverberating around as it had in the narrow tunnel-like cave they had come through, but muttering far away, high in the air. Barney swung round in a circle, vainly peering into the dark. The space round him must be as big as a house, and yet he was in the depths of Kamar Head. He paused, irresolute. The candle was burning down, soft between his fingers. The thought of the towering dark man in his strange empty house came back to him suddenly, and with all the feeling of menace that surrounded their pursuers, the enemy, who so desperately wanted to keep them from finding the Grail. Barney shivered with fright and sudden cold. It was as if they were all round him in the silent darkness, evil and unseen, willing him to go back. His ears sang. Even in the great empty space of the cave, he felt that something was pressing him down, calling him insistently to turn away. "Who are you to intrude here?" the voice seemed to whisper. "One small boy prying into something that is so much bigger than you can understand. That has remained undisturbed for so many years. Go away. Go back where you are, safe. Leave such ancient things alone." But then Barney thought of Great Uncle Mary, whose mysterious quest they were following. He thought of all that he had said right in the beginning of the battle that was never won but never totally lost. And although he saw nothing but the shadows and the blackness all around his small, lonely pool of yellow light, he suddenly had a vivid picture of the knight Bedouin, who had begun it all when he came fleeing to Cornwall from the east. In full armor, he stood in Barney's mind, guarding the last trust of King Arthur, chased by the same forces that were now pursuing them. And Barney remembered the story that Bedouin was buried on Kamar Head, perhaps directly above the cave where he stood, and he was now frightened. There was friendliness round him in the dark now as well as fear. So Barney did not turn back. He went on, sheltering his small dying light into the dark that gave back in whispering echoes the sound of his own steps. And then above his head, he became aware of a noise stranger than anything he had ever heard. It seemed to come from nowhere, out of the air, a husky, unearthly humming, very faint and far away, yet filling the whole cave, wavered up and down, high and then low, like the wind that sings in the trees and telegraph wires. As the thought flickered through Barney's mind, he held the candle up and saw that over his head the roof opened into a kind of chimney, rising up and up and up out of sight. He thought for an instant that he saw a point of light shining down, but his own light dazzled his eyes, and he could never be sure. And he realized that the noise he could hear was the wind far above, blowing over the hole in the rocks that they had found that morning. The singing down in the cave was the singing of the wind over Kamar Head. It was almost by accident, as he was looking up, that he saw the ledge. It jutted out from the rocky side of the chimney, and at the end of the cave, a bump of rock beneath the hollow, like a kind of natural cupboard, just within his reach. Inside it, he saw the glint of a candlelight reflected back from a shape that was not part of the rock. Hardly daring to breathe, he reached up and found his hand touching the side of something smooth and curved. It rang beneath his fingernail with the sound of metal. He grasped it and took it down, blinking at the dust which rose from the ledge as he did so. It was a cup, heavy and strangely shaped, swelling out from a thick stem into a tall bell shape like the goblets he had seen pictured in his books about King Arthur. He wondered how the artists could have known. He could hardly believe that this, at last, must be the Grail. The metal was cold in his hand, dusty and very dirty, but with a dull golden sheen underneath the dirt. There was nothing else on the ledge. The candle flickered suddenly. The wax felt soft and warm, and Barney guessed with a shock that it would burn for only a few moments before he would be left alone in the dark. He turned away from the ledge to the direction from which he had come, and realized how lost he would have been without the line tied to his waist. The vast round chamber of the cave stretched out all around him into the dark. Only the line, straight out and thin, told him the way to go. He walked towards it. The line dropped to the ground and then drew taut again. Simon must be pulling it. Barney clutched the Grail to him with one hand and held up the candle, now almost burned away, with the other. Excitement bumbled away any of his fears he had felt before. "Simon," he called, "I found it." There was no answer but his own voice whispering back at him from the empty cave. "Found it, found it," a dozen voices, each his own, from every side, and the light flickered and went out. The line stayed taut as Barney put his hand on it and walked slowly forward. "Simon?" he said uncertainly. There was no answer. For a moment he saw in his mind a terrible picture of Simon overpowered and helpless, and on the other side of the narrow passage in the rock, a tall, sneering figure of Mr. Hastings taking in the line as if he were playing a fish on a hook and waiting. Barney's throat felt suddenly dry. He held the Grail tighter to him in the darkness, his heart thumping. Then he heard Simon's voice low in the darkness before him and very muffled. "Barney? Barney!" Barney put out his hand and felt the rock where the roof dropped suddenly to the narrow part of the cave. "I'm here, Simon. I've found it. I've got the Grail." But all the muffled, urgent voice said was, "Come on out quick." Barney went down on his hands and knees, wincing again at the pressure of the sharp edges of the rock. Carefully crawled into the crevice that separated the two parts of the cave, bumping his head in the dark on the low, uneven roof. He held the grail upright before him, but it knocked against the side of the rock and rang out, to his surprise, with a long musical note as clear and true as a bell. He saw a dim glow lighting the farther end of the crack, and then the bright star of a match, and Simon crouching low and pulling the line with his free hand. The shadows made his eyes look big and dark and alarmed. He stared at Barney as Barney emerged, forgetting everything at the sight of the tall cup. Simon had been growing more and more anxious, and only the feel of Barney still moving at the other end of the line had stopped him from squeezing through the narrow gap himself. He had stood alone in the dark, straining for every sound, longing for light, but forcing himself to keep the 6 remaining matches in his pocket for the journey back. It had seemed a very long time. He took the cup from Barney's hands. I thought it would be a different shape somehow. What's this inside? Where? Look! Simon felt inside the cup and brought out what looked like at first a short stick, almost as dark with age as the cup itself. It had been wedged between the sides, and Barney had not seen it in his haste. It's very heavy. I think it's made of lead. What is it? A kind of tube, like the telescope case, only a lot smaller. It doesn't seem to unscrew, though. Perhaps it just fits together. Simon pulled experimentally at the tube, and suddenly one end of it came off, like a cap, and wound in a roll inside. They saw something very familiar indeed. It's another manuscript! So that's what he meant when he said. Simon broke off. He had taken hold of one end of the rolled parchment in an attempt to pull it out of the tube, and the edge had crumbled away at his touch. With sudden caution, he jerked his hand away, and in the same instant remembered why he had called so anxiously for Barney to come out. We can't touch it. It's too old. And Barney, we've got to get out as quick as we can. Jane gave 3 pulls on the line just before he came back. The tide must be coming in. If we don't get out soon, we shall be cut off. As the boys disappeared into the mouth of the cave, Jane had settled herself to lean against the lone-standing rock amongst the wet pillows of seaweed and the gray-green sweep of flat granite causeway around the cliff. She tucked the telescope case carefully under her arm. Even though she had always been with Simon when he was carrying it about, she felt a peculiar unnerving sense of responsibility as the thought of what was inside. Gradually she paid out the thin fishing line from the neatly wound wad in her hand. The pressure on it was uneven, as if inside the cave the boys were moving forward and then stopping every few moments. She had to concentrate to keep the line from either pulling too tight or drooping loose on the ground. It was very hot. The sun beat down over the towering gray cliff, and she felt the heat prickling along her skin. Even the rock she leaned on, was baked by the sun, and she could feel the warmth of it through her shirt on her back. Behind her, the water swished gently as it washed the edge of the uncovered rocks. There was no other sound anywhere at the lonely foot of the headland, and with the sea stretching all around, and without the line moving in her hands, Jane could have believed that she was the only person in the world. The land and the gray house seemed very far away. She wondered idly if their parents had come back from Penzance yet, and what they would think when they found the house completely empty with nothing to show where anyone had gone. She thought of the 3 figures they had seen striding out over Kamar Head, led by the fighting Mr. Hastings, black and long-legged like some giant insect. Instinctively she looked up at the cliff, but there was no sound, no movement, only the great gray sweep of rock that leaned over her in permanent, unmoving menace, with the green cap of grass in the headland at the top 200 feet above. And then Great Uncle Mary followed them into her mind. Where was he? Where had he gone this time? What, so near the end of the quest, could possibly have been important enough to take him away? Never for one moment did Jane think that he could have come to any harm, or have been captured by the enemy. She remembered too clearly the utter confidence with which Great Uncle Mary had swept her into his arms on the midnight headland. They dare not follow if I am here. I wish you were here now, Jane said aloud, shivering a little in spite of the hot, still air. She was not happy with Simon and Barney deep in the darkness where anything might be lurking, where they might get lost and never get out, where the roof might fall in. Great Uncle Mary would have made sure that nothing like that could happen. Jane looked at her watch. It was 12 minutes past 5, and still the line in her hands was moving slowly and irregularly into the cave. She gave 2 strong, deliberate tugs on the line. After a pause, she felt it move twice in reply, but faintly the line was 2/3 unwound. She wished she had measured it as she let it go. Time dragged by. Still the line pulled insistently out of her hand, moving into the dark entrance more slowly now. The sun blazed down, immovable out of the empty blue sky, and a small breeze sprang up from nowhere to lift the edges of Jane's long, loose hair. She leaned against the rock and let her senses drift, feeling the heat of the sun on her skin, breathing the sea smell of the wet rocks and the seaweed, and listening to the gentle lap-lap of the sea. Then in a kind of sleepy daze, with only her fingers awake, she became aware that the sound of the sea had changed. She jerked to her feet and swung round. To her horror, the piles of seaweed nearest the sea were swaying up and down in a swell that had not been there before. Waves were washing over what had been on the edges of the rocks nearer her, she thought, than they had been. The tide was on the turn. Jane felt panic begin to rise within her. The last few loops of the line were loose in her hand now. The boys must be in an alarming way inside the cave. She took firm hold of the line, winding parts of the slack round her hand and going right up to the dark mouth of the cave and jerked it hard 1, 2, 3 times. Nothing happened. She waited, listening to the regular swash of the waves creeping in. Then, just as tears of fright were beginning to prickle in her eyes, she felt the answering signal, 3 faint tugs on the line pulling at her hand. Almost at once, the strain lessened and the line began to fall slack. Jane let out a great breath of relief. The line came towards her as she pulled at it, slowly at first and then more easily, faster than she had paid it out. Then at last, Simon and Barney, blinking at the daylight behind hands raised to shield their eyes, came stumbling out of the narrow entrance of the cave. "Hello," Simon said foolishly, sounding dazed. His matches had run out 5 full minutes before they reached the light, and the last part of the way had been a nightmare journey in the pitch dark, walking blind and trusting to feel of the line to tell them that the way ahead was clear. He had made Barney let him go first. All the time he felt that every next step might bring him crashing against rock or face to face in the dark with some nameless thing, and he would not have been surprised when they emerged to find that all his hair had turned white. Jane only looked at him with a small wry grin and said he had. "Hello, look," Barney said and held up the grail. Jane felt her grin widen with delight. "Then we've beaten them. We've got it. Gosh, I wish Gameri were here. I think it's made of gold." Barney rubbed at the metal. Out in the sunlight, the grail seemed far less magical than in the mysterious darkness of the cave. But a bright yellow gleam showed here and there through the dirt on its side. "There's a sort of pattern scratched all over it, too," he said, "but you can't see properly without cleaning it up. It's terribly ancient. But what does it mean? I mean, everyone's trying like mad to get hold of it because it can tell them something. But when you look at it, there doesn't seem to be anything it could possibly tell anyone. Unless that pattern's some sort of message." "The manuscript," Simon said. "Oh, gosh, yes." Barney took the small, heavy lead tube from the cup and showed Jane the manuscript inside. "This was wedged in the grail. It must follow on from where our manuscript leaves off. I bet it's tremendously important. I bet it explains everything. But it breaks up almost as soon as you look at it." He carefully fitted the cap back on the tube. "We've got to get it home safely," Simon said. "I wonder if there's room. Wait a minute." He took the telescope case from under Jane's arm and unscrewed it. Their own familiar manuscript stood out from the lower half, fitting it closely. Simon took the dark leaden cylinder and dropped it carefully inside the center of the parchment in the telescope case. "There. Got a hanky, Jane?" Jane took her handkerchief from her shirt pocket. "What for?" "Like that," Simon said, fitting the handkerchief in a tight ball inside the top of the parchment roll. "It'll keep the new one steady. We'll have to run if we're going to get off before the tide catches up with us, and it'll get bounced about a lot." Automatically, Jane and Barney turned to look again at the sea. In exactly the same moment, each of them gasped with a noise of pure, strangled fright. Simon had bent his head to screw the 2 halves of the case back together. He looked up quickly. The waves were lifting, the seaweed now within 6 feet of where they stood. But that was not what was wrong. Jane and Barney, arrested in mid-movement, were looking further out to sea. For a moment, the one jutting rock obscured Simon's view. Then he too saw the tall, sweeping lines of the yacht Lady Mary, under full sail, come round the end of the headland towards them. And he too saw the tall, dark figure standing in the bow with one arm raised, pointing. "Come on, quick!" He grabbed Barney and Jane as they stood motionless with shock and pushed them ahead of him. They jumped and slithered over the seaweed-cushioned rocks, away from the cave and the pursuing yacht. Barney clutched the grail in one hand as he ran, his arms outstretched to keep his balance, and Simon held the manuscripts in their case grimly to his chest. He glanced back over his shoulder and saw the great white mainsail of the yacht crumbling down onto the deck and a small dinghy being lowered over the side. Barney slipped and fell and nearly brought them both down on top of him. Even as he fell, the grail did not leave his grip, but struck the rock once more with the same clear bell-like note as before. It rang out over the sound of their splashing, hasty feet. He struggled up again, biting his lip at the sting of salt eating into a graze on his knee. As they hurried on, they were splashing through the water all the while now. The waves had grown and were washing right over the rocks with every pulse of the rising tide. The water masked the pools and hollows with drifting brown weed, and glossed the bare rock with a swirling coat that would turn, soon into a current strong enough to dislodge their quick, desperate feet. Barney slipped again and fell with a splash. "Let me take it." "No!" He scrambled for a foothold, Jane pulling him up by his free arm, and the frenzied nightmare of a race drove them faster, zigzagging in wild, blind leaps over the wave-washed rocks. Simon glanced back again. Two figures in a small dinghy were paddling fast towards them from a yacht. He heard the yacht's engines cough into life. "Go on. Quick," he gasped. "We can still do it." They hastened on, half stumbling, kept on their feet only by their own speed. Still there was no sight of the beach round the headland, but only the sea on one side and the great wall of cliff rising on the other. And before them, dwindling into the tide, the long path of rocks and weed. "Stop!" a deep voice rang out across the water behind them. "Come back, you stupid children! Come here!" "They won't catch us," Simon panted, catching Barney as he almost fell a third time and jerking him back to his feet. Jane at his side was sobbing for breath at every step, but running and stumbling with the same desperate haste. Then round the headland, in front of them, something else came into sight, and dropped their hopes, like stones, to the bottom of the sea.